We often believe the spaces we inhabit are entirely our own, that once we lock the door, the outside world and its history are shut out. But what if a house refuses to forget? What if the very walls around you are still holding on to the memories of those who stood there before you? In Korea, every corner has a story, and some are deeply stained with things that shouldn't have been left behind. Today, we explore two chilling accounts from two very different worlds. Do you have a friend who's always talking about their lineage, like they were born into some noble bloodline? And they'll go on and on about where their clan originates, which branch they belong to, how many generations back their family name carries weight. I have a close friend exactly like that. He says those things so often it's basically a habit. And honestly, nothing about how he acts is particularly noble. So nobody ever cared whether his family history was really that special or if he was just bragging to make himself feel important. But there's one thing. If you've ever been to his grandfather's house, you immediately understand why his bragging isn't completely baseless. His grandfather's home is in one of those places in Korea where the moment you say the name of the region, people nod like, oh, that kind of town. The kind of place known for old, established families, historically noble households, living in that area for generations. And the house itself? The simplest way to describe it is, it looks like a living folk museum. It isn't a single building where you walk through one front door and everything is inside. It's a traditional compound with separate buildings. The inner quarters, the outer quarters, a kitchen building, storage buildings. And each one has that heavy old tiled roof. The kind that makes the entire place feel like it's been standing there forever. Even the walls are topped with tiles, like the house is wearing a second roof around its edges. These days, my friend and I lining up our schedules to go anywhere together has become a rare event, like a major occasion. But a few years back, every summer we would spend about a week at his grandfather's place, staying there just to hang around. To be honest, for two city kids like us, it wasn't like there was anything thrilling to do there. But for some reason, both of us liked sitting on the wooden porch, what you might call a veranda, listening to sudden summer rainstorms hit the tiles, watching the courtyard darken and shine with water. So that yearly visit felt like the house itself became our playground. This story, though, isn't about my friend and me. This is about what happened when my friend's mother first married into that family. Right after the wedding, she spent about 3 months living there without her husband during the week. Before they got married, my friend's parents had been looking for a place to live as newlyweds. And after searching everywhere, there was only one house they truly liked. But the people living there at the time wouldn't be moving out until 3 months after the wedding. Still, they loved that house enough to sign the contract anyway. And for those 3 months, the husband continued commuting from the boarding house he was staying in near his job, while his wife went down to the countryside to live with her in-laws, partly to learn the household customs, partly because it was simply practical. On weekends, he came down by train or express bus. And so those first 2 months passed in what you could call a smooth newlywed life, just split between weekdays and weekends. In that large house, her mother-in-law and father-in-law lived there, and so did her husband's younger brother, my friend's uncle, who at the time wasn't yet old enough to be married. There was also an older woman who had lived with them for a long time, a distant relative who helped manage the household work. My friend's father also had older siblings, 2 older sisters and 1 older brother, the eldest son. but at the time all three were already married and living elsewhere. So the countryside house, despite being enormous, had a surprisingly small number of people in it. And even though she was the new daughter-in-law, there was help in the house. So it wasn't like those dramatic stories where a young bride is forced to do impossible labor, breaking ice in winter to wash clothes in a stream or anything like that. There was really only one thing that consistently made her tense. The elders woke up early, ate early, and everything in the house moved according to that rhythm, which meant she had to wake up on time and help the older woman set the breakfast table. Even when she set an alarm clock, because she was still so nervous as a new bride. She usually woke up before the time she planned to, lying there in the dim light of early morning with her heart already beating too fast. But there were days when the warmth of sleep still pulled at her, and she'd bargain with herself. 5 more minutes, just 5 more minutes. And that day was like that too. She grabbed the alarm clock, decided she would lie down for only 5 minutes, and slipped back into a shallow sleep. And then, half asleep, she heard someone call out to her, "Young mistress," not ma'am, not miss, not anything modern. Young mistress, the old-fashioned kind of address a servant would use for the lady of a noble household, a word people don't use anymore. She startled awake, checked the time, and it was as if the voice had been perfectly timed. Exactly 5 minutes had passed. She told herself she must have imagined it, that she was just anxious and half dreaming, and she got up and went to help with breakfast. A few days later, it happened again. This time, she wasn't dozing for 5 extra minutes. She was asleep deeply, completely sunk into it, and once again that same gentle voice pulled her out of sleep. "Young mistress." Her eyes snapped open, and when she looked at the clock, about 20 minutes had passed beyond the time she meant to get up. The alarm clock itself had clearly rung, because the button that silenced it had been pressed, as if she had turned it off without waking properly. If it weren't for that voice, she would have overslept badly and spent the whole morning trying to hide it from her in-laws, embarrassed and flustered. But instead, she made it in time. And because it was no longer a one-time mistake, she felt genuinely unsettled. She opened the door, stepped out, looked around, even checked the hallway, but there was no one there. And the strangest part was the word itself, young mistress. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd expect to hear in that era at all, even decades ago. And it certainly wasn't how anyone in that household addressed her. So she mentioned it to the older woman who helped in the house, the distant relative who worked there. But the older woman just waved it off, saying something like, "You're new here, you're tense, your sleep is light, that's all it is." My friend's mother wanted to accept that explanation, but she couldn't shake the feeling. The voice was unfamiliar yet oddly soft, almost kind, as if it was trying to help her, as if it wanted her to wake up on time. And that combination, being grateful and terrified at the same time, made her feel cold from the inside. She had avoided mistakes because of it, but now she couldn't stop wondering, was that voice real? Did it truly exist? And if it did, who was calling her and why? Still, she had only been married into the family for 2 months. She couldn't exactly sit down at dinner and bring up something like that as if she were telling a folk tale about goblins or superstition, and she wasn't in a position to casually ask her in-laws about ghosts in their house. So she kept it to herself and tried to convince herself that maybe she was simply nervous, and a few more days passed like that. About a week later, the plan had been for her husband to come down for the weekend as usual. But because the move-in date for their new house was close, he had to handle things, choosing wallpaper, organizing the move from his boarding place, preparing everything. So he decided he wouldn't come down that weekend. Instead, he told her to come up to Seoul, spend the weekend there, help choose wallpaper and finalize preparations, and while she was there, she could also see her own mother, who had been helping from her side. It would be her first real outing since marriage, the first time she would be leaving the countryside house for herself. On Thursday night, she packed lightly and went to bed a bit later than usual, because she planned to take a train to Seoul Friday morning. It had only been 2 months, but she missed Seoul intensely, and more than anything, she missed her parents, and she was so excited that night that she slept the way children do before a field trip, half awake, restless, mind racing ahead of the morning. She only truly drifted into sleep near dawn, and then she felt something. It was that moment when the darkness begins to thin, and everything in the room takes on a faint bluish tint. Not bright, not fully morning, just enough light to make shapes feel sharper. The room looked normal at first, so she closed her eyes again until she heard a soft rustling sound near the foot of her bedding. A small, dry sound, like fabric brushing fabric, close enough that she felt her body tighten instantly. She didn't know what to do, so she pretended to be asleep and tried to sense what was happening without moving too much. The sound stopped as if she'd imagined it, and after a moment she carefully began to roll onto her side. That's when she felt it. A small movement near the edge of her bedding, right below her shoulder, only a short distance away. She kept her eyes mostly closed, barely open, and slowly bent her neck down to look. Her bedding was the old, thick style, a padded mattress with cotton inside, and a fabric cover, thick enough that even a child stepping on it would leave obvious dips and footprints. What she saw was not a foot, not a knee, not a body. She saw the edge of that thick bedding press down, then lift, then press again in small pulses, like someone was gently pushing it with a hand, or like small feet were walking up along the side, one careful step at a time. The depressed spots moved. They crept upwards, slowly, steadily, along the line of her bedding, traveling toward her face. She couldn't speak. She couldn't even breathe normally. Her throat tightened and her body turned rigid, as if making noise would make whatever it was realize she was awake. The small depression stopped when they were only a short distance from her face, just a few hand widths away. And then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. Less than a minute. But it was close enough, clear enough, and wrong enough that she spent the entire morning unable to forget it. And even on the train to Seoul, the scene kept replaying in her mind. At that point, it wasn't just strange. She felt genuinely afraid to sleep alone in that room again. When she arrived in Seoul, it was still early afternoon and her husband hadn't finished work yet. So she went first to her parents' home, just as planned. And once she was there, surrounded by familiar warmth, she finally relaxed and started talking. She told her mother and her younger sister about life at the in-laws' house, about the routines and the elders, about the compound and how everything was run. And then, hesitating, she brought up the things she hadn't been able to stop thinking about. The voice that woke her, always calling her young mistress, and the feeling that morning of something pressing and moving along the edge of her bedding like a careful small presence. Her younger sister tried to laugh it off, half joking. Maybe you need to go see a shaman or something. But the word shaman, even as a joke, hit a nerve, because my friend's mother had already been feeling uneasy and trapped, and for a moment she actually wanted to do it, to find someone, anyone, who could tell her what was happening. And yet it felt old-fashioned, embarrassing, like something only superstitious grandmothers did. So she didn't say more. That evening, she met her husband after he got off work, and the night passed in late conversation and laughter with her family. And the next morning, after her husband left for work, she went out with her mother to choose wallpaper and arrange renovation schedules and handle all those small preparations that make a future home feel real. In the flow of that busy weekend, the strange things from the countryside house faded a little, as if they belonged to another world. And then Monday morning came. Her husband went directly to work from her parents' home, and she was supposed to leave with him and head back down to the countryside afterward. But her mother, her own mother, kept insisting strangely that she stay just a little longer, repeating it without fully explaining why. And as soon as her husband left, her mother took her by the wrist and led her outside, saying only, "We're going somewhere first, and then you can go down." My friend's mother asked where they were going, but her mother just said, "I'll tell you on the way," and continued guiding her. In the taxi, her mother finally admitted it. From the moment her daughter arrived and mentioned those things, the voice, the bedding, she couldn't let it go. And she couldn't, in good conscience, send her back without doing something. My friend's mother tried to calm her, saying she was fine, that she was just tense, living with in-laws for the first time, that it was probably nothing. But her mother shook her head and said, "Even if you say you're fine, I can't just ignore it." And that's how she ended up being taken to a small Buddhist temple. My friend's mother was Buddhist, but her own mother was especially devoted, the kind of person who poured real sincerity into her faith. Now, in the strictest sense, fortune-telling and ritual superstition don't align neatly with the original teachings of Buddhism. But instead of going to a shaman, her mother had decided to seek a monk who was known, quietly, for having a sensitive perception for these things. When they met the monk, they didn't even begin by explaining what had happened. They simply exchanged greetings, and before my friend's mother could say a single word about the countryside house, the monk looked at her and said something that made her blood run cold. "You won't suffer from harsh in-law life," he said. And then, as if he were speaking about something he could already see, he added, "Day and night, there is a presence watching over the young mistress." The phrase young mistress was the same, the exact same. My friend's mother said her head spun, like her mind couldn't catch up to what she'd just heard. The monk continued calmly, as if it were obvious. The in-laws' house was very old, he said, and there was nothing to fear, because it wasn't something that meant to harm her. It was helping her. It was taking care of her. But he also said that the spirit was pitiful, and that she should do as he instructed, and together they would send a wandering soul on its way, so it can finally reach somewhere better. The monk sat cross-legged, closed his eyes, and began chanting quietly. After a long time, he spoke again. Before her in-laws' generation, just a few generations back, there had been a very young noblewoman who married into that family. In those days, if a family had any means at all, they didn't send their daughter alone to a new household. They sent 1 or 2 servants with her, so she wouldn't suffer. So when that young noblewoman, still practically a child, arrived at the family compound, a servant girl came with her, a girl slightly older than her, though by modern standards, still a child herself. That servant girl left her own parents behind and followed the noblewoman, serving her faithfully. But for reasons no one now remembered, the servant girl died before the noblewoman did, before she could serve her for life as she believed she was supposed to. And because of that, the monk said, the servant girl never fully crossed over. She remained near the house, carrying guilt and grief, still searching for the young mistress she had been assigned to protect. Time passed, generations changed, and then my friend's mother married into that house, and by coincidence or by fate, the wandering servant girl found her. The servant girl saw a new young mistress in the same household and began doing what she had always done, waking her at dawn, staying close, caring for her, guarding her. The monk said the spirit was not malicious, but her attachment was too strong, and that was exactly why she couldn't move on. To send her onward, they needed a link, a physical object, something tied to the servant girl, something that anchored her to the household. Without that link, the spirit would continue wandering, forever serving, forever unable to be reborn. My friend's mother asked the obvious question. After so many generations living in that house, how could they possibly find anything connected to a servant girl from that long ago? But the monk said the opposite was more unbelievable. He said the fact that the spirit remained so clearly meant the link existed somewhere, hidden, forgotten, but still there. And so, with no clear method except that conviction, my friend's mother went back to her in-laws' home and began searching. From that day on, whenever she had a moment, she opened old cabinets and wooden chests, checked storage spaces, looked through rooms she barely used, like she was hunting for a relic in a museum. And in truth, now that she believed the spirit wasn't trying to harm her, she wasn't as frightened. Instead, she began to feel a painful sympathy. A servant girl born into someone else's household, made to work, sent far from home while still young, dying before she could return, and even after death, lingering only because she couldn't let go of her duty. Thinking about that made my friend's mother feel sick with pity. She also felt strangely that it had become her responsibility, almost like a debt, that she had to be the one to help this spirit end what she had never been allowed to finish. One day, she was searching in what used to be the granary, now used more like a storage room. It was where the family's ritual tables and ancestral items were kept for holidays. And even though it was called storage, it was maintained under her father-in-law's strict care, organized and clean like a private museum. I've seen it too, and it really does feel more like an exhibit room than a messy warehouse. As she searched, her eyes caught something in the corner, a large wooden rice chest, the kind families once used to store huge quantities of rice. By that time, most households no longer used such a thing unless they were extremely large, so the chest had gradually become a makeshift shelf with various small items placed on top. It stood out to her, but at first she dismissed it. It didn't look like it had anything to do with the servant girl. Then that night she dreamed of it. In the dream, she walked into the storage room and went straight toward the rice chest, as if being pulled by something. It wasn't a dramatic dream, not a nightmare, nothing supernatural in the way people expect. But when she woke up, she couldn't stop thinking about that chest. So the next day, she went back into the storage room, removed everything stacked on top of it, and lifted the lid. Inside, she found bundles of charcoal wrapped in newspaper and an old embroidery hoop, round, used for decorative stitching. And beneath those, there was a small wooden box with a handle. She picked it up as if she were in a trance, sat down right there on the floor, and opened it, The inside was lined with paper, and inside were small sewing tools, a tiny thimble with faded color, a small pair of scissors that had rusted but still had a delicate shape, a small wooden tool that seemed meant for winding thread. There was also a palm-sized pincushion and, astonishingly, needles still stuck into it. But she couldn't tell how old the sewing box was because her father-in-law maintained old items so well that age didn't always show clearly. So she brought it out and asked her father-in-law about it. Not knowing what was truly happening, he laughed and teased her, asking if she'd been searching the house for treasure for days, only to find that. My friend's mother asked carefully, and through his answers, she learned it had belonged to his grandmother, passed down and used for embroidery, not for rough mending, but for the kind of refined needlework noble women once did. Later, because there were no longer women in the family skilled in that craft, the box had been kept away, stored, eventually ending up buried inside the rice chest. But even knowing all of that, she still couldn't tell what could possibly serve as the servant girl's link. If it was a refined embroidery box used by noble women, it didn't seem like something a servant girl would own. And yet there was one item in that box that kept drawing her eyes back: the cloth pincushion. She said she couldn't explain it. Her hands went to it again and again. Finally, as if possessed by a stubborn thought, she gripped the pincushion with both hands, found the stitched seam at the center, and pulled until a few stitches tore. A small gap formed, just large enough to push a fingertip into. And from that gap, something came out. A clump of black hair. Later, she learned something that makes it even worse in hindsight. Needles back then weren't stainless steel. They rusted easily. They weren't smooth, and people would sometimes grease them. And in some households, they would make pincushions stuffed with human hair because it held the needles well and protected them. What my friend's mother had found, what she felt compelled to find, wasn't the sewing box itself. It was the hair inside the pincushion. Even now, nobody can say for certain whose hair it was. But my friend's mother made a decision immediately. That day, she took the pincushion outside, went to a spot below the stone wall, and burned it completely, holding it there until she was sure there was nothing left. And as she watched it burn, she prayed quietly, repeatedly, words like, "Go now, please go. In your next life, be born into a gentler fate." About 10 years ago, the place I lived wasn't just a small town. It was the kind of rural area where nothing new ever happened, where most buildings were low and old, and where moving into an apartment was something people would talk about for weeks, like it meant you'd finally crossed into a different kind of life. Then the area started getting developed and a new apartment complex was built. Government-style public housing, the kind that goes up fast, looks clean when it's brand new, and becomes a landmark simply because it's the only one. They built it by cutting into the local hillside, and even before people moved in, there were rumors that spread through the neighborhood. In that particular way, rural rumors always do. Quiet at first, then suddenly everyone seems to know. The reason wasn't hard to guess. During construction, they relocated a lot of graves from that hill. And as they dug deeper, they also found bones that didn't seem to belong to any family who could claim them. Remains with no clear identity, no one to take responsibility, no one to move them properly. But to my family, that wasn't the kind of thing that felt immediate or real. We weren't the sort of people who had the time or the energy to treat rumors like warnings. We were thinking about something simpler. We were about to live in an apartment. When we first saw it, it looked luxurious to us. I know how that sounds, because if you saw that same building today, you'd probably call it worn out and shabby. but back then it felt like a symbol of success. Just living there made every day feel like we'd stepped up in life. We moved into a fifth floor unit, and right after we moved in, almost immediately, my mother started getting sick. I was young, but the image of her face still sticks with me in a way I can't explain. Deep shadows under her eyes, like exhaustion had wrapped around her whole face and refused to let go. She looked drained even when she was sitting still, like the apartment itself was pulling something out of her. At the time, I didn't know how to interpret that. I didn't even understand that it could be connected to anything. And honestly, what I'm about to tell you is what mattered. In our family, we all slept together in the living room, my parents and me, because that's what many families did in small apartments back then, especially when the rooms were limited and heating costs mattered. The only one who slept in his own room was my older brother. That first night, I clearly remember my parents were asleep beside me in the living room, and I couldn't fall asleep, so I was just lying there with my eyes open, staring into the dark in that half-bored, half-restless way kids do. And then I saw them. Two men, black silhouettes, walking past the TV. They weren't shadows cast by headlights. They weren't reflections. They had shape and weight, and they moved the way people move when they're not trying to be quiet, like they belonged there. But here's the important thing. I was so young that the word ghost didn't even mean anything to me. I didn't have the concept. I didn't see horror. I just saw adults. So I watched them blankly, like I was watching strangers in a room that for some reason didn't feel strange. And from that day on, I saw those two men almost every night. Sometimes they'd walk out to the balcony like they were stepping out for air, standing in the dark behind the glass. Sometimes they'd linger in front of the TV, and this is the part that sounds ridiculous even to me, play rock, paper, scissors with each other, moving their hands as if it mattered who won. Sometimes they'd sit down near my sleeping mother and stare at her face for a long time, close and intent, and then they'd drift into the kitchen and start arguing, like an ordinary couple bickering, except the voices were low enough that I couldn't always catch the words, only the tension. And I didn't scream. I didn't wake my parents. I didn't run. I just watched night after night like my brain had decided that was now part of the apartment, the same way the refrigerator hum or a neighbor's footsteps can become normal if you hear them enough. One day, it happened in the daytime. Bright daylight, no shadows to hide behind. My parents had gone out to work, and my brother had gone outside to play basketball, and I was home alone. I got bored, and my mouth felt empty in that kid way where you suddenly think you need candy or a snack. So I took a 501 coin, barely anything, basically the price of a small treat, and went to the neighborhood store. Then I walked back, and as I got close, I did what kids do. I looked up at the building and counted floors with my finger to find our balcony. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. As soon as I reached our floor, I saw a man step out onto the balcony. He leaned forward slightly and waved at me, beckoning. In my head, it was instantly my father. There was no doubt. A man at my home, waving? That's my dad. So I shouted, "Dad!" as loud as I could. But the man didn't answer. He just kept motioning for me to come inside. And because my father normally came home around 7 in the evening, the idea that he was home early made me happy in a way only a kid can feel. Pure excitement. And I ran, breathless, straight up the stairs and into the apartment. But the moment I opened the door, the apartment was empty. No one was there. I called for my dad again and again, walking deeper into the rooms, feeling confusion rise, but still not fear. There was no response, no footsteps, no voice, not even the sound of someone shifting in a chair. And somehow, even then, I shrugged it off. I was a kid. Kids accept the impossible if it happens inside something they already trust. Another time, my parents were out again, some kind of gathering for couples, and it was just me and my brother in the apartment. My brother was in his room, and I was in the living room watching TV. The TV we had then was huge and heavy, one of those old sets that's thick in the back. So big it felt like furniture. I was sitting there, focused on the screen, when something rose up from behind the TV. A man's face. Not a reflection, not a picture. An actual face lifting into view, as if someone had been crouching back there waiting. It was one of the two men I saw at night. He looked directly at me and told me to hug the TV. Not asked, told. And because I was a child, because an adult voice telling you to do something can feel like a rule of nature, I tried. I wrapped my arms around the TV, straining, my small body pushing against something far too heavy. The man watched me, then smiled, wide, pleased, and shoved. He pushed the TV toward me. The weight tipped. It fell against my chest. I remember the impact more than anything else. The air being punched out of me, my body collapsing backward. The sound of something huge hitting the floor, and then my brother bursting out of his room because of the noise. After that, everything goes blank. I woke up to my mother crying. And even that wasn't where it ended. There was another day, art class had ended, and I came home to an empty apartment again. I turned on the lights, sat down, and watched cartoons, the kind of ordinary after-school routine that makes a childhood feel safe. Then I heard something in the kitchen. A presence, movement, like someone standing there. When I looked, I saw my father. He was standing in the dark kitchen, just inside the boundary of the light. I felt relief instantly and called out, asking when he got home. And then, without warning, he started screaming at me. Not scolding, not yelling in frustration. He unleashed a stream of vicious profanity. Words so ugly I still hesitate to repeat them even now, spitting them out like he hated me, like the sound of them was what he'd come for. He got more and more worked up as he spoke, as if his rage was feeding itself. His face flushed red. The veins in his eyes became visible, and he leaned into the hate until it felt like the room was full of it. I was 7. I cried and shook because I believed it was my father, and I couldn't understand why my father would look at me like that. And while I was crying, I looked again past him toward the dining table. Another man was sitting there, watching, quiet still like he was waiting for his turn. At some point, exhausted from crying, I fell asleep right there on the living room floor. And when my mother came home from work later, she woke me up. The first thing I did was tell her, sobbing, that Dad had yelled at me, that Dad had cursed at me. But my father wasn't home. It wasn't even close to the time he usually returned. That was the first crack in reality. My first moment of realizing that what I'd been seeing wasn't just me being a kid. And for a long time, I still tried to believe it was only me. Kids do that. You assume you're wrong. But I wasn't the only one being targeted in that apartment. Years later, when I was old enough to actually understand words like ghost, my mother told me what she had experienced there. And that's when the whole thing stopped feeling like weird childhood memories and started feeling like a place that had been inhabited by something that noticed us. One late weekend night, my father went fishing. I was asleep in the living room, and my brother was asleep in his room. My mother was alone, taking a bath. It was around 3 a.m, the quietest hour of the night, the hour when even the building feels like it's holding its breath. and she was soaking in the tub when she heard the bathroom door being pounded. Not knocked, pounded, hard, urgent, like someone angry or desperate. At first, she assumed it was me or my brother needing to use the bathroom. But the thing was, neither of us ever knocked in that house. If we had stomach pain, if we had to pee, we would just twist the handle and come in. Kids don't have bathroom etiquette, and that was normal for us. So pounding without even trying the handle made no sense. But still she called out, told whoever it was to wait, and then reached for the door. When she opened it, there was nobody there. The hallway outside was empty. She called our names, no response, no movement. She went back to the tub, unsettled but still trying to rationalize it, until she heard voices, male voices, outside the bathroom, close enough that it felt like they were standing just beyond the doorframe. Two men talking, laughing quietly, like they were sharing a joke. "She's taking a bath," one of them said, snickering like it was funny. "Yeah," the other answered. "I told you, keep your voice down. She'll hear." A soft burst of laughter. Then, "She already heard, didn't she? Think she's looking." My mother's skin went cold. At first she thought maybe it was the neighbors, sound carrying strangely through the building. But our unit was at the end of the hallway. There wasn't another apartment directly beside us the way there would be in the middle units, so that explanation didn't hold up. When she told me this later, it clicked with what I'd seen as a child, and I told her I used to see two black men walking around the living room at night. And that was the moment my mother stopped treating my childhood stories like childish imagination. But it still wasn't only me and her. My brother suffered the worst in that apartment. He would get sleep paralysis constantly, what we call being pressed down in sleep. And he even developed sleepwalking. My mother felt sorry for him, so she sometimes slept next to him, hoping her presence would calm whatever was happening. One night, she put her hand on his stomach the way mothers do, like an anchor. "I'm here. You're safe." She fell asleep like that and then woke up because the hand she'd placed there was suddenly moving violently up and down, like something underneath it was breathing too hard, or shaking, or struggling. Half asleep, she assumed it was my brother shifting or twitching. Then her eyes adjusted enough to see what her hand was actually resting on. It wasn't a stomach. It was a single eye, black, bloodshot, staring up at her. She jerked back so hard she nearly fell off the bedding, and in the same instant she saw something else. A dog, close by, panting with its tongue out, breathing in rough, wet bursts, its eyes wild, its body tense as if it wanted to bite but couldn't. And then she looked past the dog. Outside the window, a man was standing there, just standing, looking in, watching her. My mother told me later that it was the most terrifying part of all because it wasn't sleep paralysis. She could move, she could turn her head, she could pull her hand back. She wasn't trapped in a dream. The man outside the window met her gaze and held it. And she didn't look away because she was sure that if she broke eye contact, even for a second, he would climb through, as if the moment she stopped watching him would be permission. So she stared. Minutes passed. Her heart was racing so hard she could feel it in her throat, but she kept her eyes locked on him. Then the dog's breathing grew louder, and without thinking, she glanced at it. Just a reflex, a quick look down. And when she looked back at the window, the man was gone. After that night, my brother's sleepwalking began in earnest. My father later described it like this. My brother would get up at night, take off his pants, and try to open the front door and leave. Old apartment locks back then weren't like modern digital locks. There were multiple physical mechanisms. One latch at the top you slid into place, another lock you turned, and then the doorknob itself. And yet my brother, asleep, could undo all of them. My parents tried locking everything, even all 3 layers. But he would still stand there, fumbling with purpose, insisting he was going out, shouting when they tried to stop him, struggling like a grown man even though he was a kid. Sometimes it got so loud that neighbors came out into the hallway to see what was happening. Then, without warning, he would collapse, fall asleep again, and later get up and wander through the apartment as if he were searching for something. This repeated almost every night for the 3 years we lived there. And because touching a sleepwalker can sometimes make things worse, my parents stopped trying to physically restrain him once they realized how violently he fought, and instead they watched, terrified, praying he wouldn't manage to get the door open and step out into the hallway. Of course, my brother remembered none of it in the morning. We moved out after 3 years. But even now, when I think back, the apartment complex itself felt wrong. Like it was built on something that never accepted being disturbed. Bad things happened around it. Next door, there was a family with a middle school boy. His parents were divorced and his father struggled with alcoholism. 2 years after we moved in, that boy hanged himself in the apartment. People in the neighborhood said his father would come home to an empty place, no one left. Yet he would still kick the front door and scream for his son to open it, night after night, like grief had made him lose the boundary between reality and obsession. And beneath our unit, several floors down, there was a woman known as a shaman, and she terrified me as a child. Whenever she saw me, she would say something about a bogeyman figure taking me away. Something like the Korean equivalent of the old man with the sack. Or she would spit when she passed me, and I remember feeling humiliated without even understanding why a grown woman would treat a child like that. Even now, I live near that area, but I still refuse to go anywhere near that apartment complex. There was also a massive building nearby, something as large as a department store. But it seemed cursed by failure. One disaster after another happened there until it became abandoned. Another department store project right beside it was completed but never even opened, collapsing before it could begin. The neighborhood itself had a foul smell that would come and go for no clear reason, like something rotting in the ground that nobody could find. And there was a girl from my elementary school, pretty quiet, whose mother drove a small white compact car and, one day, killed both of them in a murder-suicide. I remember the chrysanthemums afterward. In Korea, white chrysanthemums are funeral flowers, and even as a child, seeing them placed there made the entire memory feel like it had a smell, like death had its own texture in that neighborhood. When people ask me now whether I really believe what I saw in that apartment, I don't try to convince them. I just know that in that place, my mother got sick for no reason we could explain. My brother began sleepwalking like he was being summoned, and as a child, I watched 2 men move through our living room at night, as if it was their home too. And what scares me most is that none of it felt dramatic while it was happening. It felt routine, like they had always been there, and we were the ones who didn't belong.